my design concept is, how do we allow our guests to play with all those cool things in the themed environment in a way that they can't get hurt? The effects themselves won't get hurt by people. And so mobile phones were that bridge. You couldn't grab the ship's wheel, but when you pressed the button and it spun, you knew you did it. So you had that feeling of, dare I say it, agency without the physical contact.
That is Jonathan Ackley, who's here to talk about Sorcerers of the Magic Kingdom and a bunch of other cool interactive experiences created for Walt Disney Imagineering. You're listening to the Tomorrow Society podcast. Thanks for joining me here on episode 164 of the Tomorrow Society podcast. I am your host, Dan Heaton. Hope you're all doing well out there as we roll into late March. Can you believe it? It's crazy how fast this year is going. I am super excited about this week's show, talking with Jonathan Ackley. Jonathan has been so closely involved in creating so many of the interactive experiences that we've enjoyed at the parks during the past 15 years or so. He started as a game designer at LucasArts, working on games like Curse of Monkey Island, so many other cool projects. So it makes total sense that he ultimately would do similar things, but in a different medium for Walt Disney Imagineering, including the Kim Possible's World Showcase Adventure, and its sequel, Agent P, the Menehune Adventure Trail, which I loved when we went to Aulani at Disney Resort and Spa. My girls had so much fun with it. And Sorcerers of the Magic Kingdom, which lots of people enjoyed playing with the cards all over the original Florida park. Plus, a Pirate's Adventure, which I found a lot of fun when we went through Adventureland. I found myself in strange corners of Adventureland trying to figure out how to make some weird thing happen, like a cannon fire or this snake do something. It was really fun. And beyond that, it was just cool to learn more about Jonathan's story and to also get his thoughts on where gaming and interactive experiences are going in the parks. Because, we started out with rides like Buzz Lightyear and a lot of similar ones where you're basically shooting at targets, or even Toy Story Mania in the future. And we've evolved a bit where you're using, I wouldn't even call them scavenger hunts, but you're exploring lands in a different way and able to interact with parts of the land, not just as a passive observer, but as doing something active. And that feels like something that's going to continue to evolve and become more important in the parks as guests don't just want to, I love old Epcot Omnimover attractions where you sat and went by scenes, still really works for me, but I know a lot of guests want to be more involved in feeling like a character and really getting into the story, and Jonathan has played a huge role in making that happen at the parks. So it was a blast to talk with him and learn more about a lot of things he's worked on and his philosophy about how gaming kind of fits in theme parks. He also is an author. He recently wrote a book, Off by One Serious Games, which you can purchase now. And we talk about that and what made him interested in writing a book and the story of that novel that he put together. So there's a lot to cover here with Jonathan, so let's get right to it. Here is Jonathan Ackley. Before you even started working on game design as a career, how did you originally get into games and just being interested in that when you were growing up?
Well, largely it was because my parents wouldn't let me have video games. They wouldn't buy me an Atari 2600, which all my friends had, and other friends had ColecoVisions. My cousins had a ColecoVision, which if you've ever played Smurf Adventure on ColecoVision, fantastic.
Yes, I have.
Fantastic game. But they did not like video games. As a matter of fact, the quote was, "Video games are from the devil." And I was too young at the time to realize that they were right. So I was going into 8th grade, and I wanted to take the advanced science class in my junior high, and I wanted to take it because it had computer programming for one of the modules they were teaching. And so at this time, computers were super expensive. So there was a single Apple II, and that sat at the front of, there was a single Apple, and we all had Timex Sinclairs with membrane keyboards and powerful 2K memory. And so I took the class just so I could do this computer thing. These computers were horrible. They had built-in BASIC, but you couldn't just type in the words. You actually had to find like the print button and press the function key and the print and things. And so after learning how to program on these horrible little machines, I went home and said, Mom, can I have, a Timex Sinclair? And she went out and she bought me one, but with the 16K expander module, which made it super powerful. But also had the added advantage that when you push down on the membrane keyboard, the memory module would rock and pop out and recycle your entire computer, which was fine because you really couldn't program more than like Hello World with it anyway. So it was terrible. So she took it back that night. I was distraught. How could she take my beloved computer? And she came back with an Atari 400. And my parents didn't have a ton of money, so they really extended themselves getting me an Atari 400, and it was the best gift ever. Atari Basic had actual graphics instead of like trying to do graphics with the characters and letters that the Sinclair did. And I worked on that for, I don't know, probably until I was a junior in high school. And so they said I could play video games, but they had to be video games that I wrote myself. And so maybe this was their plan all along, or maybe it was just they inadvertently found a career for me. But that's what I did, largely to the exclusion of everything else. I would just come home and I would program in the dark on this computer attached to an old TV set, which very quickly the blue background burned out the blue gun in the tube. And so it had like pink faded spots all over it. It was terrible and it was wonderful at the same time. But I didn't think I was very good at math. And so when I went to college, I didn't want to learn computers because I was convinced I could never be a professional computer programmer because I didn't like doing math, not realizing the computer does the math for you. So I went to UC Santa Cruz and I got a theater arts degree because, that's useful, in film production, and came out, got a job doing menial tape transfer at Industrial Light and Magic. And I wasn't there very long. I got laid off, but I had been working on the movie Hook. So here I was, a young man with money burning a hole in my pocket, and I immediately got a girlfriend, and I had nothing to do all day, so I would just call her at work. So her boss got really bugged at me calling all the time. She said, well, if you've got nothing else to do, come in and I'll give you something to do. And they were doing a educational prototype for the Richmond School District. And so I came in, and initially I was just getting the rights to pictures from image libraries. And soon I was largely programming most of the prototype. And when that project finished, both my girlfriend, now my wife, we got eaten by LucasArts because the prototype was written in their SCUM system. So I was already trained. Then I started on Day of the Tentacle, which was my first shipped professional game, which was fantastic. The amount of talent at LucasArts during that time was simply ridiculous. You had Tim Schafer and Dave Grossman, Peter Chan and Colette Michaud and Steve Purcell and Mike Stemley and Vince Lee, who was a development wrecking crew on his own, like the only programmer on Rebel Assault and the designer and the project lead. And then there's my wife, Casey, who is a fantastic designer. It was just unbelievable the amount of interactive talent I was surrounded with. So it was just a fantastic place to learn. It was probably 50 people when I joined the company.
LucasArts seemed to grow a lot, at least in terms of the games. I mean, I remember playing Maniac Mansion when I was a kid, like on my Commodore 64. And then it seemed like you mentioned, some of the Star Wars games took off. I mean, so how did it grow after you joined, where you ultimately worked on more games like Curse of Monkey Island, and then the company seemed to just keep releasing these games that are still known now?
Well, largely, I think we benefited from neglect. It was a movie company, so you had ILM and you had the movies that Lucasfilm did, and we were just this little company that nobody paid attention to because we were a bunch of nerds. You know, compared to the budget of a feature film, even an expensive video game was kind of a rounding error. So you could do experimental, kind of wacky, artistic stuff. As a matter of fact, when I started, people didn't want to do Star Wars games. The feeling around LucasArts was, why would I want to make a game based on one of those old movies? And then Vince came out with Rebel Assault, and all of a sudden it's like, yeah, maybe we should make more Star Wars games. So it was really, really an awesome time. The adventure games were sort of, at the time, sort of the prestige stuff. It was like, creating our own IP. And then the Star Wars projects bankrolled our prestige projects. So, the company grew. Adventure games didn't really grow in terms of the target audience, which became an issue as the games got more and more expensive. Every time we wanted to make a new adventure game, we wanted to set the bar higher. The graphics had to be cooler. We added voice. We added orchestral streaming music. Like Curse of Monkey Island used a proto version of MP3 before MP3 was a thing. So there was all this sort of innovation going into this thing, but the target demographic for adventure game wasn't growing. Meanwhile, 3D games were kicking butt. LucasArts also had some amazing talent making those. You had Ray Gresco and Justin Chin and Rob Huebner of Descent fame, all working on things like Dark Forces and Jedi Knight. And I sort of knew the game was up for adventure games when, after we'd shipped Curse of Monkey Island, I went into the programmer's office. They were running around in this 3D shooter. I'm like, this is interesting. What is it? And he's like, oh, it's this new game. And he climbed on board this gondola, and the gondola started moving. I'm like, oh, that's a neat feature. You can ride a gondola. And then the credits started to roll in front of the gondola while you were running around interactively. And I realized, oh crap, storytelling has come to 3D. I kind of think this might be the end for little paper dolls walking around in a cardboard box games. And that game was Half-Life.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And that was sort of I think technology is going to move forward, and so should I.
Yeah. So you ultimately ended up moving from the gaming world into games for Walt Disney Imagineering, and I mean, a bit later from Curse of Monkey Island. But I'm curious about what made you decide to start looking possibly in that direction, or ultimately to where you would still be doing gaming, but in a very different medium.
Well, that was actually where I wanted to go right out of college. It was the first place I sent my resume, was Imagineering. As a matter of fact, I think I might have even dropped it off at the lobby because I was sleeping on a friend's couch in Silver Lake here in Los Angeles. And I got, a postcard back from them. We got it. We'll call you if your skills meet our needs. And they never called. After LucasArts, my wife and I had been doing game consulting, and we decided to start a family. And we figured, well, if we're going to have a family, we can't have two freelancers in the family. So I took a job at Lego Mindstorms and was there for, about a year and a half. And I loved that company. Lego is a fantastic company. It's a family company. They believe in the product. Lego's just damn cool. And this was the toy robots division, which was even cooler. And so, I had hopes that I was going to start, designing robot toys for kids. And that was very exciting. But every once in a while, I would go on the Imagineering or the Disney website, and I would just send my resume, just like, well, maybe they'll call me back this time. So I sent my resume in, through the HTML form on the webpage in 2000, whatever, and they called me back. But I wasn't planning on moving. We decorated the baby's room and, but I wanted to go down and I wanted to interview with them and just see what it was like, but wasn't planning on moving down there. The day they called me back and offered me the job, we were all called into the office for an all-hands meeting at Lego and told they were shutting down our office.
Oh, wow.
And so, I think the universe is trying to tell me something. So we packed up with a newborn and moved down to Los Angeles, which, is a lot of fun, leaving your support system and relocating 800 miles away or however much it is.
You mentioned wanting to work for Imagineering. Did you have a lot of history with Disney or Disneyland and going there, or what kind of drove that interest?
Everybody kind of loves Disney, especially, in the 70s. We didn't have a lot of money, so we might have gone 2 or 3 times in my entire life. There's a picture of me at 3 being absolutely terrified by Winnie the Pooh. It was the huge Winnie the Pooh, and he had the honey pot on his head and then the bee sticking out of it. It was just enormous. And there I was looking up at it, just scared witless. But we loved it, particularly Pirates of the Caribbean and Haunted Mansion, which I think is everybody's vote for the greatest dark ride of all time. And at one point I was, saying to Casey, my wife, someday I'm going to work for Disney. I'm going to live in Pirates of the Caribbean. I've been there after hours now. You don't really want to live in Pirates of the Caribbean.
I've heard it's kind of frightening in there after hours.
Tell everybody that you don't want to live inside that ride. But we would go and loved it. It was aspirational for my family to go. My home park was Marriott's Great America, which I think opened in 1976. And at that time, it was a real theme park. I think it is much less a theme park now, but it was heavily themed. And so you no longer have like NASCAR Days of Thunder simulator next to the tidal wave roller coaster in Yankee Harbor. But back then, the theming was just top-notch and gorgeous. And so I always wanted to work in themed entertainment and do that kind of storytelling. And I think if you work in video games or anything digital, there's a certain romance to atoms that you don't get from electrons. And so you're just like, well, I can do anything I want in this box, but boy, I wonder what you could do out in the real world. And I was lucky enough to find out. So it was very, very cool to get that chance.
Yeah, so you ended up joining, I believe, the R&D department in the early 2000s. What were some of the projects you kind of got started on when you joined Disney?
I was brought in on the enhanced television team. So there wasn't really this thing called broadband that went to people's homes. There was this horrible thing called dial-up that made awful noises at you when you tried to log in. So it was still early days, and the idea was two-screen content. So Monday Night Football would be going on, and you would guess what the next play was and who was going to get the ball and how far they were going to go with it. There were leaderboards and there were trivia, and I wrote a little, kick the football mini game, and it was all pushed down, synchronized to the broadcast. And I guess it was relatively popular. But the idea of research and development is you want to come up with the idea and productize it. And so I think my major contribution to that project was getting it to the point where we could hand it off and kind of get out of that business, and give it to ABC or ESPN so they could run their own game. So that was my first project. And after that, my boss just came to me one day and he had a phone. And it was the Nextel i80, I think. Maybe the i88. It was this candy bar phone with a gray screen on it. He's like, this is a new phone. It runs Java. You should do something with it. And it's surprising how much of research and development is, I got this thing. What can we do with this thing? And so I wrote an enhanced TV client for it and I did some mini games. It was really fun, but we didn't really do anything with it because there was no real market for phone apps at the time. It was just kind of interesting. But I got kind of really into this phone. It was cool. I couldn't figure out why. It was the first phone that had true internet protocol. So you could reach it from the internet. It could reach back out of the internet. And so I just started having fun writing fun apps to do on the thing. GPS tracking. I thought, well, I'll do this interactive map. Maybe it could lead you through a theme park. It couldn't. The phone was just it was too slow. If it was faster, it could work. I wonder if someday people will use phones to find their way from place to place. So it was really fun. And I just kind of dove into mobile and then, broadband applications. And then, what can we do with new packaged media like Blu-ray? And it was sort of like, as new technologies arise, how can we look at it and abuse it for the fun and enjoyment of our guests? And it was just that sort of fun playing around with mobile phones that led to the Kim Possible World Showcase Adventure, which was just done as a playtest initially. It wasn't really intended to be an attraction. It was just like, well, we'll do this prototype and, we'll make the company smarter about things you could do with a mobile phone and, it'll be cool. Literally, my boss came to me one day and just said, "You used to make adventure games, right?" I'm like, "Yeah." He's like, "You should do one for World Showcase." Okay. And then we did the playtest and it received such positive response that all of a sudden I was a theme park producer.
Wow. It's interesting how that happens. But I'm curious too, for that game, I mean, when you actually start really working on it, and you have these existing structures, World Showcase, most are from, were built in the early 80s for 1982, and you're adding, new effects. I mean, I'm not curious about individually. I just am curious for you, like, what's it like to have to go into something that is so set in stone and kind of almost rethink it for a game?
Well, let's see. I mean, you don't worry so much about the infrastructure. What is amazing about working in a theme park that's been around so long is you see the history. And you appreciate what the Imagineers who came before you did with the stone knives and bear skins. You find little bits of technology, little pieces of computer that were assembled in the 1970s because there weren't general purpose computers like we have today. They had to go out and make or glue circuit boards together. And then, they would etch a little thing that said property of WED Enterprises, and they would bolt that thing on. And it was amazing. I kind of think that we as humans were smarter before computers showed up. When I see the incredible things that the Imagineers did before microcomputers. Like if you've seen how the American Adventure, that thing is astonishing. Everything they do. And, during the time they engineered it, and it was, just some people with slide rules and pencils and, engineering genius. And, that's kind of the fun thing. We bring in our modern technology, so it's not like we're trying to glue our stuff to those ancient systems, but you really appreciate what they were able to do with the technology of their time.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, the people I've talked with, or what I've learned about some of the early Epcot pavilions, American Adventure is a great example where with, I forget, they call it like the War Wagon. They call it the War Wagon, which is one of the craziest things that I could think of and they built it in like you said, like 1980. So you're adding games to the park at a time when it wasn't like now there are many, it's very common. But I mean, what was kind of the interest, or, was that a time when there was really a push to add more games to the parks in general? Or was this still kind of on the front end of the interest from the company or even the theme parks?
It wasn't really a focus because the parks were not really broken. So it wasn't like people were looking at the parks and saying, my gosh, if only this were interactive. I think one of the challenges was to put something together that wasn't like the greatest fears of the Imagineers, right? Which would be, Yeah, I'm coming in and I'm installing Ms. Pac-Man machines throughout World Showcase, which might have been how some people, thought about what we were going to do. And then they were pleasantly surprised when they saw what we were doing was fitting the theming and fitting the story and blending in as best it could. So that experience was designed actually based around a frustration of mine, which is that theme parks are filled with super cool props and you can't play with any of them. And there are good reasons you can't play with any of them. Like, you go in as a big ship's wheel. What do you want to do? You want to grab that wheel and you want to spin that sucker as fast as you can. But you do that and it goes clunk because it's been bolted, so you can't do that. And the reason is because some kid's going to stick his head through the spoke and then another kid's going to spin the wheel. And secondly, if you let people touch and move things, they're going to break it. So it becomes a nightmare. And so my design concept is, how do we allow our guests to play with all those cool things in the themed environment in a way that they can't get hurt? The effects themselves won't get hurt by people. And so mobile phones were that bridge. You couldn't grab the ship's wheel, but when you pressed the button and it spun, you knew you did it. So you had that feeling of, dare I say it, agency without the physical contact. So that feeling of control over the theme park environment is really what makes those experiences powerful and what makes it fun.
Kim Possible, like you said, very successful. And then I'm jumping ahead a bit, but I feel like it makes sense to mention it here, is that then it was upgraded where I have more familiarity with Phineas and Ferb because my daughters love that show and we played the game. And how did that come together and why was that such a good fit? Because it's such a fun TV show and it really fit well in World Showcase.
What are we going to do today? Let's go to a theme park. I mean, I think the very first Phineas and Ferb episode was they were building a roller coaster. That license fits really well because those kids can do anything and for any reason. And so if you're trying to justify why this crazy stuff is happening around, it's really easy to do it. Doofenshmirtz has built a crazy machine. The kids have built a crazy machine. There's a mystery that Perry the Platypus is trying to solve. All three of those things come together in a way that makes sense for an adventure that's about finding crazy hidden contraptions around the world. So, we worked with the creators. Dan and Swampy are just spectacular and fun people, and as were the creators of Kim Possible. It's just really fun using those characters, or rather partnering with them to have those characters go on these great adventures. But really, they're the secondary characters. The main character is the guest, and the characters are really there just to kind of give flavor and humor and tell you to do this ridiculous thing and give you a totally implausible explanation for why you need to do this thing. But you do it because that's the excuse you need to have fun and play as in that world. So I think great characters are key to why the Agent P World Showcase Adventure worked so well when we relaunched it.
Yeah, I mean, because I think about when my daughters were that age, and we've never spent so much time just in one World Showcase pavilion, like in these corners. I think at the time it was Norway at the time before Frozen or anything, and we're back by the waterfall, and there's all kinds of crazy areas. And that's something that I would not have probably done, especially if we would have gone to the attraction or shop, but we're not going to spend an hour in the same area and in a completely different way.
Yeah, and the playtest actually had some features that I'm sort of sorry now that I took out. There were these things called bonus missions, which really were ridiculous. It was basically, it just said, I can't tell you why, but you need to go to the tea shop and look at this map on the wall and tell me like what's right next to Birmingham. And then you would go there and you would answer a multiple choice question. And if you got it right, you'd say, yeah, thanks. For no reason whatsoever. and it was hugely popular. But I kind of dropped it out in adapting the thing. But it was pointless interactivity because there was no real story behind it other than I need you to tell me this thing. And people loved it. And the reason they loved it, I think, is the Imagineers, especially in World Showcase, put so much awesome detail that pointing it out to the players got them to appreciate all the detail. Because it was just like, we just walked through the pavilion and like, that's cool, that's cool, that's cool. Let's just get the guests to look at it. And we got feedback saying, I'd been through World Showcase. We're annual pass holders. I've been there hundreds of times. I never looked at this thing. Thank you for showing me this thing because it's really cool.
Yeah, and that really stands out to me about all the different games that have been done, but especially that one, because World Showcase is like, there's a lot to cover in the mile circle around, especially if you're only there for a day or two. So to be able to do that is super cool. And on a similar note, the Menehune Adventure Trail at Aulani, we were lucky enough to go there a few years ago in 2019 and pretty much played every single version of that game, the indoor, the outdoor. Again, just had a blast, and I feel like it was so epic. Some of the effects, I was like, whoa, I did not expect that whale to do that or something. And so I'd love to know a bit about how that came together, because that's a really cool part of that resort.
Well, you mentioned earlier about trying to fit one of these things in an existing facility. The advantage that the Menehune Adventure had was that it was conceived and executed by the creative team that was building the resort. So we were able to integrate those little bits of magic in a way that wasn't bolted on after the fact. So we knew that it was going to have all these awesome rock sculptures in the shape of animals hidden throughout the resort. So, hey, why don't we make one of those a whale and have the guests be able to trigger the whale to shoot up the blowhole, or some of the more kind of dramatic and exciting locations are inside the caldera. Mm-hmm. When it gets all hot and the lava starts flowing, which by the way is not something that will happen on that island. Those volcanoes are very, very, very extinct. So don't worry if it appears that it's going to erupt. The producer for that resort, Jeanette Longboy, we were actually partners on Kim Possible. I sort of brought the gaming side, and she was a more experienced theme park producer. So it was a great pairing on my first project. And so she had a total understanding of the interactivity and what the goal was. And so, I think largely she wanted to be able to do that sort of interactive storytelling, and brought me into design. So it's all about kind of telling the story of that place and of the guests who are visiting. And so we were able to do a lot because we looked at the stories that were already being told in that backyard area or in the lobby area and saying, well, how can we take that and make that interactive?
Well, I want to shift gears a bit to the Magic Kingdom with several games you did there. The big one being Sorcerers of the Magic Kingdom, which opened in 2012, and to me was, really a big change for the Magic Kingdom. And I'd love to know from you your work on creating it, and then kind of the goals of putting that into, the original Florida park.
So Sorcerers of the Magic Kingdom, it's probably the project I'm proudest of because it's, the most unusual in terms of what it does and how it plays. And it was another, I think, one of those projects where my boss came to me and he said, hey, we've got this IP, maybe you should do something with it. And I think we didn't wind up using that IP, but my initial reaction was, I don't want to do that. On the other hand, he was my boss. So I thought, well, maybe I should, think about it. And so I started looking at different gameplay styles and interfaces that I could adapt to the physical theme park world. Agent P, it's very much LucasArts adventure game translated for a physical world. So, well, okay, what else could we do other than an adventure game? And I looked at this RPG, and it was an electronic RPG but the interface was a card interface. You picked cards electronically and played it against bad guys, and that determined how you did in this video game. And I thought, well, that would be cool if we could just like have Magic the Gathering style trading cards or Pokemon trading cards, and you could just hold them out and those would cast spells. That's a pretty cool mechanic. We could do a whole role-playing game based on that. I wonder if we could do that. Because at the time, that was hard to do. Nowadays, everybody's phone has the capability of doing similar things. But in 2008 or whenever I had this idea, it was magic. And so I turned to a friend of mine at Research and Development, who I had actually brought in, a fellow named Chris Purvis, who was a programmer on Curse of Monkey Island. He was now at R&D. And I'm like, hey, Chris, I got this crazy idea. Would there be a way that our guests could hold out spell cards and we could magically know what they were holding out and we could cast spells on bad guys? He's like, well, let me make some calls. And so he was launched into sort of a research project to see how we could cast spells using playing cards. And then I partnered with some other fellows on how we could make villains appear out of nothing. So then there was an entire other sort of R&D project separate from how do we cast spells using playing cards. And we did a whole bunch of mock-ups until we convinced ourselves that it was possible. And then we had to determine whether or not that worked with human beings, because there are actually three sort of different parts to a technology project, entertainment project, that I think you need to do simultaneously, which is the interface, the story, and the technology all have to match. So you could get two of those things, but if you don't get the third, then it doesn't work. So we had technology, or magic rather, that could tell when you were casting a spell card. We had an overall idea for a story, which matched that spell casting idea. But would the interface work with human beings? Because, if it's one way you can really get yourself in trouble, it's convincing yourself that you're going to teach a human being to do something, a new behavior. I've been making video games for 30 years. I've never taught a human being a new behavior. You're just sort of playing psychologist and like, what's a human behavior that people enjoy doing that I can leverage? And so then we tried it with people, and sometimes it worked better than other times. And so we kept iterating until our guests could cast magic spells. And then we were able to move forward and productize that. But there were some terrifying nights during that project when you're wondering, like, sure wonder if this is going to work when you open it up to all the guests and all the different people and all the different play styles. And then it was very gratifying when it opened. There were half-hour lines at each of the portals, which was great for us and not so great for the operator. But we were very, very, very happy about that.
An interesting part, which of this game, is the cards, because it seemed to me that people would be interested then in trading and in some of the other aspects beyond the game. Did you anticipate that the cards would become souvenirs and be something that people really enjoyed beyond what they did with the game?
Yes. And I won't say that because, I'm very farsighted. I just looked around and saw how popular cards and card trading were. So as long as we made sure that the spell cards were of high value and high quality with, beautiful character art, doing interesting things on it, we knew that they would be collectible. And we wanted this attraction to be valuable to our guests. Playing the game is one value that Sorcerers of the Magic Kingdom brought. The collecting of the cards brings its own value. So I think the attraction works on several levels, both the collecting and the gameplay.
Yeah, I agree. I think it really worked well. And another attraction at the Magic Kingdom, the Pirate's Adventure, Treasures of the Seven Seas. What I really enjoyed about that too was you get this map. And so it's even a little different to me than just like Asian Peas or something or with the phone. And I, again, though, found myself going in all these crazy parts of Adventureland. So I know this is like the next step in terms of that type of game, but I'm curious for you kind of what stood out from this experience or from creating another thing people could do in the Magic Kingdom.
When designing for pirates, I tend to just think of what are all the cool things I want to do and how can I justify doing those cool things. And in that way, game design can be pretty easy. You just brainstorm in this theme. I'm a spy. What do I want to do as a spy? Or I'm a sorcerer. What do I want to do? I want to cast spells. We can't have people swinging from yardarms. We can't have people sword fighting. So like, what are the cool things that you could do as a pirate? Like lighting a fuse of gunpowder and having it blow up. Yeah, we can simulate that. That's pretty awesome. Or what if, some bad guys have blowguns and they're going to try and zap you? Like, well, we can have blowguns pop out of a bush and fire darts at you. Sure, we could do that. You just love Adventureland, right? That's one of those iconic places as a kid. That's one of those, when Walt did his TV show on the run up to Disneyland, you wanted to see the stories from Adventureland because they were just so darn cool. So being able to install themed elements in Adventureland is like, that's your kid's dream come true. So now there's a 13-foot high giant idol in the middle of Adventureland. And most people don't even know it's interactive. They just think that's amazing new theming, but that's only the top layer. Then underneath that, there's magic that happens with that, which is even more powerful because it's the guests causing that magic to happen.
Yeah, I agree. There were things that I totally came to life and I went, wow, I don't think I've noticed that, which is a good sign because then it's like you mentioned, it's functioning on multiple levels, like as good theming and as the game, which is, I'm sure, based on what you've said, is what you're looking for with a lot of these projects we've talked about.
Yeah. It's like, what would be a cool thing to do? Well, I want to shoot a deck gun into the water and I want to have, the cannonball make a splash, or I want to blow the lock off that chest. And I want to curse a human being terribly so they become an undead skeleton that rises out of the water. It's a little grim, but it's fun. So
I want to do all those things. So that's good. So also too, speaking of like things that are interactive, I know you were also involved as a show writer for the interactive queue at the Haunted Mansion, which, speaking of something that can really just sidetrack getting through the line for my daughters because they enjoy it, that's another, I feel like, a fun way to bring an attraction to life. So I'm curious for you about working on that and kind of the goal track, getting through the line, and on, like you mentioned earlier, such, a classic attraction.
It was fun. I'd love to do more with Haunted Mansion or with Pirates of the Caribbean. They're just my favorite rides ever, and I know I'm not alone in saying that. I'll tell one story of what happens when you put a Disney nerd in a room with a Disney legend. I was part of a program early on in Imagineering where it was called, Designer Enrichment, and they exposed us to a lot of new things. And there was an event where we got to meet some of the historic Imagineers, and I got seated next to Exitencio, who's, along with Mark Davis, are like, oh my gosh. And I'm terrible in front of my heroes, just the worst. And someone at the table said, oh, Mr. Atencio. And someone at the table, did you work on? And of course, I blurted out, you made Haunted Mansion and Pirates of the Caribbean. They're like the greatest theme park rides ever. And X never made eye contact with me for the rest of the meal. But those rides are, I think, why probably 90% of Imagineers want to be Imagineers.
Yes, I've talked to a lot of people, and the Disneyland Pirates and Haunted Mansion are referenced about 90% when people talk about the attractions that inspired them. You get a little bit of Epcot, but it's mostly those two. Well, I want to ask you about one more kind of big project you worked on, which you referenced earlier about phones and kind of how they've evolved. And that leads well into talking about the Play Disney Parks app, which, still now is playing a big role in things like Galaxy's Edge and with some of the really recent attractions. Just when you're looking to find a way again to have people playing in the parks, how tricky is that? Or, what's it like trying to kind of connect the phone and the game to these existing physical places and such cool areas on their own?
Well, theme parks are tricky because although they seem solid, like, they've been there 50 years or they've been there 75 years, every day they change and every day they're new. I have huge respect for anyone who works in a theme park because they see stuff. There's millions of people who go to these parks every year, and weird stuff happens every day, and they have to be on their toes. And new rides open and new attractions open, special events, and different people come. So it is a moving target because a theme park is a living, evolving thing. And so when you are creating something that's going to install in that park, you have to be aware that it needs to be flexible and it has to work for the park. It's not just, an expression of your ego. No, I want this thing and I'm going to put it in and it's going to work the way I want it to work, because it can't work that way. And so when you're designing for a theme park, there's a partnership that needs to go on with the people who run the park, just as there's a partnership with, the guests who come to the park who are going to play your games. So everything that I've done has been informed by people who are smarter or more experienced than I am. So you can come in with this, I've got this genius idea. We're going to add interactive skydiving with guests throwing off the top of the castle. And then, someone from operations will say, Jonathan, that's really the dumbest idea I've ever heard. And I'm not even going to explain to you why. And you just need to respect the fact that they really do know better than you. And so it is always a partnership. It is always a collaboration to get these things in and work. And as the park changes, sometimes you need to update what you've created because it's different all the time. And so, when you start designing things, you need to talk to everybody who's going to touch it or be affected by it, understand their point of view, understand their goals, and try and make it match with what they need to do just to operate a theme park every day. So I have just been fortunate like crazy to be working with the greatest park operators in the world, at Disneyland, the Magic Kingdom. The people at Tokyo Disney Sea are just astonishing what they can do. So I've just been super fortunate throughout my career to have been partnered with a lot of people who've prevented me from making really terrible mistakes.
I also wanted to ask you too, speaking of something else you're doing, is that, like I mentioned, you recently published a book and have been an author for a little while. Your book, Off by One, Serious Games. So I'm curious for you, like, what got you interested in becoming an author, and then to learn a little bit about this book?
I have wanted to write a novel for a very, very long time. But in case you don't know, making video games and theme park attractions is a time-intensive activity. So I think it was back in 1995, I read an article just in the newspaper that they had detected seismic waves in the heart of Russia. And the theory was that they were taking the old USSR nuclear arsenal and they were taking them down into these deep mines, and they were detonating these nuclear bombs underground and reading the seismic waves to find mineral resources, particularly diamonds. And so I thought, well, boy, that would be a really fun, dramatic sort of idea around which to base a book. And suddenly, I guess it was 2 years ago. Well, maybe it was a year ago. suddenly I found myself with time to explore that. And I wasn't making video games, which can leave you brain dead at the end of the day. And so I would just sit down and I would spend 3 or 4 hours working on this book. And they say, write what you know. So I made the character a very flawed video game designer. And I just poured all of my flaws into this main character. And I finished the first draft of the book and I showed it to people. And everyone hated the main character because he was so unappealing. Like, well, maybe I should make this character a little less like myself and move some of his negative attributes into other characters. So I got a lot of feedback. I learned that writing a novel is very different than writing a short story. So I had the first draft of the novel in about a month and a half. And then it took many months after that before it was a good novel. And I love the fact that I've had the opportunity to do that, to write that book. Because, so often you're adapting other people's stories, whether it's Disney stories or Disney Channel stories. These are characters that come from you and your experience. And then you add nuclear explosions. So what could be more fun?
Sounds good to me. No, I'm definitely interested in it, and I think it sounds like a great premise for a book. And I'm not talking about the lead character and you. I just mean the story sounds interesting. But I only have one more question for you, which is, you've worked in various different elements of gaming, theme parks, video games. Looking ahead to the future, what are you excited about, whether it's a new technology or some new type of gaming that you find really interesting that might be coming either now or in the future?
So, there's much talk of the metaverse, right? But I think if anybody really knows what the metaverse is going to be, or if they tell you that they know what the metaverse is going to be, I don't think they really know, because it starts with a bunch of ideas and bits of hardware lying around, and you glue it together and do a lot of experimentation, and then it will evolve into something different than you originally believed in. Then that will also become greater than what you hoped it would be. It'll go in an entirely different direction, and it will change society in a way that you did not expect it to change society. I am particularly excited about the idea of blending the virtual and the physical outside of the world of themed entertainment. How can we have characters and the power to control our environment and the power to express ourselves through technology in our environment? How can we create a fantasy world that is our own world? And that is intriguing to me, although as a technologist, I'm also a little afraid of that idea. Because with great power comes great responsibility, or so I've been told. So I am very interested in how do we project digital storytelling out into the physical world. And I think people have ideas about it, but I think it will be many years before we realize how that really will look, act, and work. But I also sort of have faith that the world will be changed because of it. So that is what interests me about the future.
Well, that's great. I mean, yeah, I'm curious to see where a lot of the digital, virtual, everything you just said much smarter than I tried to summarize works. And it's going to be interesting, and I hope it goes for a positive direction. Well, Jonathan, this has been great. I want to make sure and mention, too, if listeners want to pick up a copy of your book or learn more about what you do, or even if you're out on social media at all, I'd love to have you let us know where they can learn more.
Well, they can get the book in either Kindle format or paperback from Amazon.com. It's Off by One Serious Games. And I have just launched a Twitter account really in the last 2 weeks at Ackley _Jonathan. So I'm trying out this new social media thing that all the kids are doing these days. So, I'll be hashtagging with the tubes and everything.
That sounds good. Well, Jonathan, thanks so much. This has been great. I really appreciate you coming and talking to me on the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
If you like this podcast, you should definitely check out my recent interviews with Imagineers like Josh Shipley, Daniel Joseph, Karen Connolly Armitage, Kevin Lively, so many more. You can find those at tomorrowsociety.com/podcast with an S at the end, or wherever you typically listen to podcasts. If you'd like to get a hold of me, shoot me an email, dan@tomorrowsociety.com. Follow me on Twitter at tomorrowsoc, Facebook or Instagram at Tomorrow Society, or on YouTube. You can find that by going to tomorrowsociety.com/YouTube. If you'd like to support the podcast, there are several ways you can do so. You can become an official member of the Tomorrow Society and join me on Patreon. Make a small monthly contribution and get access to some really cool perks. You can find that at patreon.com/Tomorrow Society, or you can buy me a Dole Whip. Not an actual Dole Whip through the mail, but a one-time contribution to just say, hey, Dan, I like what you're doing. Go to tomorrowsociety.com/Dole Whip to learn more. The music that you are hearing right now was written by Adam Hookey and performed by the Sophisticated Babies. Next time, I will be talking with Ryan Ritchie, my first podcast guest, who is coming back for the third time, this time to talk about his really fun YouTube show called The Theme Park Trivia Show, where I was recently a contestant on episode 5. I make Ryan play a fun trivia game, lots more. I think you're going to enjoy this episode. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you're doing great out there, and I will talk to you again next time.